Sup peeps or people or whatever makes you less uncomfortable. Welcome back to another default cube CG Matter tutorial, and today we're just going to be talking about making polka dots or just scattering circles on the surface of our sphere. And as you can tell, I didn't mention it, but they are animated if you want them to be. So really, I'm just going to show you how to make this material, and since it's going to be completely procedural, it's going to work on any model, and it's going to work 100% procedurally. You don't need to think about it, which means, again, we can add any kind of model. I'm tempted to do a torus for some reason. So torus, shade smooth. We are going to shift click this to have both of them selected with this as the active object, Control L, and then materials. And you don't really need to know that, but that's just how you link a material from one object to another. So now these both have the same material. Of course, this kind of looks stretched on the torus, but that is just a result of the generated coordinates because it's a very short torus. So it's going to look stretched out, but it works on any model. You could do this on a monkey, whatever. So let me show you how to make this material because it's really easy. I'm going to start off with a new Blender project. This is what your Blender is going to look like unless you have a different startup scene. I'm going to take the cube, delete it, replace it with a model to present our material on. I've been using spheres. I don't care what you use whatever you want. So I have my sphere, shade smooth. If you don't want this, I don't know if a setting is the word, but you don't want this sharp silhouette. You need more geometry. Modifiers, add in a subdivision surface, apply. Good, don't complain about it. So now, how do we take this geometry and slap on the material? To do this, go to the shading workspace. And this is with any model. We're going to create a new material. So again, this material, this node network is being sent to the surface of this geometry because this BSDF is connected to the surface of this material output. We're going to rename the material to polka dots, which I believe has an L because it has some weird Russian spell. I don't know. I think it has an L. You'd think it'd just be P-O-K-A, but no, it has an L. Whatever. So now all we have to do is change this material. You know, right now it's linked up. You can see it's actually dynamically changing. I'm going to get rid of the BSDF and just start with our basic polka dots we want, and then we can add the BSDF in later. But the theory of how we're going to do this is we're going to use a Voronoi texture, which is a procedural texture, comes with Blender, and then we're just going to manipulate it until we get what we want. So Shift-A, Voronoi. We're going to add in that Voronoi texture. We're going to use distance, plug that into the surface, and you're going to see that we already get something that's kind of close to what we want. You can see that each one of these cells, and it's more easy to see the cells with color, each one of these cells, when we look at it through distance now, has a black circle in the middle of it, and these are what we're going to use to basically generate our circles. And you may be thinking, okay, why does that work? The reason is the way Voronoi texture is calculated, without getting really into it, is Voronoi texture just scatters a bunch of points in 3D space. And then this pattern is determined by looking at each point, not the points we generated, just a random point, and seeing how close is it to the nearest one of those points we generated. So scatter of points, and then at a random section, we just look at how close it is to one of those. And that distance gives it the color. So the circles are pretty much where the points are because it's a distance very close to 0. If you didn't understand what I said, neither did I. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in a color ramp node. You can also do an RGB curves here. We're basically just going to do a manipulation. And if we take the second handle, so not this one, but handle number 1, so not 0, but 1, and then we take this and drag it down, you can see we're kind of isolating these circles. However, there's this kind of fall off we don't want, and that's because we're using linear interpolation. You see it kind of goes from black to gray to white. So to fix that, you can either bring this one up to make it very sharp, or we're going to just change to constant, which you see just has this nice sharp, it just switches, there's no fall off. And you can see now we have our circles, and we can control it with this first handle, right? And you want to think of this as kind of the average radius, because these circles, these polka dots, don't all have the same radius, right? You know, this one's bigger than this one. So really you want to think of this as an average because we don't have consistency. But as a trend, it's going to go up if we bring up the radius, down if we bring it down. And we also have other kinds of controls. For example, the scale on the Voronoi texture, what's it going to do? Think about it. That's right, it's going to make it super, super dense, right? So we're going to have more dots per surface area. So we just bring that up, And this is pretty much what I used to make that sponge material a bit ago. But it's just a nice way to get these random polka dots. And if you don't want them to be random, you want some kind of order to their distribution, just take the randomness, and instead of having full randomness, make it have zero randomness, which looks pretty interesting on the sphere. If you do it on something that makes a bit more sense and doesn't have curvature, so that it's kind of, the dots are, the dots are really just spheres and we're looking at a cross section of it. But if you want it to make more sense, just have something without curvature and then apply this. And I don't know why we can't see it. Maybe because the scale is too big. But you can see that right here, we can actually see the grid, the order when the randomness is 0, and then we can bring up the randomness like that. But let's get rid of that. Okay, so we know scale, randomness, average radius. What about animation, right? I click play, it's not animated, it's just polka dots. There's a bunch of ways to animate it. Some of them are lame. For example, you can add texture coordinates to this. It's by default going to use generated. You can use whatever, but with this mapping node, so texture coordinates to mapping to Voronoi texture, you can take the X, Y, or Z value and just drag it to animate it, which is kind of a lame way to do it, right? You don't want to just be manipulating texture coordinates, but what we can do is take our Voronoi texture, and instead of having it be 3D, procedural, but 3D, we can make it 4D, four-dimensional. Set it to 4D. And really, what you want to think of this as, it is four-dimensional noise. But since we only see stuff in 3D, we're looking at a 3D cross-section, and that cross-section is determined by our fourth dimension value. It's kind of like if you take a sphere and bring it through a plane, it will look like a circle getting bigger and smaller. We're just choosing the cross-section. But again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's just going to kind of look like an evolution slider when we change it. So this is a kind of neater way to animate things. So again, this W slider is our fourth dimension, and you just animate it. So to actually add keyframes, hover over it, click I, you've added a keyframe. I'm going to add the timeline. Go to frame like 80, bring it over, hit I again while hovering over it, and now we've animated it. There you go. So that's pretty cool, right? I don't know. I use this technique a lot. But now the next question is, how do we get this to actually have nice lighting, right? If we go to rendered mode, right now we're in Eevee. The thing just kind of has the material, but it's not reacting to its environment. It doesn't have lighting, doesn't have shadow. It's just kind of there. And we can really illustrate that by taking this light and, it doesn't have anything, right? It doesn't have shadow on the opposite side. And that's because really what we've done is just generate what is essentially, not really, but essentially an image. We're just slapping an image onto it. It's a procedural thing, but it doesn't have any BSDF information to go through. It doesn't know how to react to light. So what we have to do is add a BSDF in between our Voronoi stuff and our surface. So you can add a diffuse BSDF, I feel like the names are blanking on me, a principled BSDF, whatever you want to do. I'm going to do a principled BSDF. What was the one I was trying to think about? It was in shader, glossy. I was thinking of glossy. You can pick whatever you want. Okay, cool. And now that we have it running through a BSDF through the base color socket, you can see that it's actually reacting to the lighting, right? It's going to have shadows because now it's processed through a BSDF, which stands for something that I forget, like bi-direction. No, BS. I forget. Either way, we've now done it, and it's animated and all this. And if you want to play around with the colors, again, this is just controlling the average radius, but there's no reason it has to be black and white. It can be red, and I feel like black is the nicest looking color. This is how you make a ladybug material, the shell of the ladybug, although I don't know if it's randomly distributed or not. But you can also do a bunch of other stuff that's pretty cool with this. By the way, this is a four-dimensional, but it's a three-dimensional effect like we talked about, so you can actually use it in the volume socket. And for that, I would recommend using cycles. And you can kind of already see that there's these kind of holes in it. It's kind of hard to tell. Maybe the way to go is to process this through some math and process it through a power. Now, we either want this to be a big number or small number. Let's try big. Let's try small. They kind of look the same. Probably need a principled volume. Because right now, it's kind of like the image being slapped on. But the 3D thing, 3D version, you still need to go through ABI SDF for lighting information. And we want this to be the density. And oh boy, is this going to take some time to calculate. Let's try big number. Try to make it more obvious. Yeah. I guess you're just going to have to take my word for it. I think you could probably see it before we added this BSDF. Let me just plug that back in. You can kind of see these circles, and you could process this through whatever you want, but it's just not showing up, and I'm also recording with OBS. Whatever. Let's just ignore that for now. But the point is, you now know how to do this with Blender. So hopefully you enjoyed this polka dot tutorial. If you did, I'm glad you did. The best way to support me is via Patreon. You could subscribe. These things help. But the best thing to do to help me out is to donate over at my Patreon. It is a donation, and that's what I'm going to call it. However, you do get benefits like early access, Discord, early access into terms of information, and soon exclusive tutorials, I think. But anybody who wants to hop on over there, you have my big thumbs up. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed this free tutorial. And yeah,